those stories. We are in the section known as Holy Week, the crisis of the kingdom, I'm calling it. Sunday, he arrives. Monday, trial day. Tuesday, announcing the verdict. It begins with the basis for the verdict in terms of the authority of the one giving it, and then the content of the sentence is this parable of the vineyard that we're going to look at as well before we're done. So, he's in Jerusalem, he's in the temple area, he's confronted by an official delegation. This is Tuesday morning. It immediately follows, in Mark's account, the fig tree incident. This is, in a sense, taking place in the, it's taking place in the so-called outer court, the court of the Gentiles, and it's the very place, of course, where yesterday this violent, upsetting intrusion by Jesus occurred. These guys are probably worried that the same thing is going to happen again. Jesus has come back, and once again he's going to interrupt the flow of business. And so they come to intercept him, to confront him, and to hopefully prevent him from being a further source of upset. The people that Mark mentions are, first of all, the chief priests. There were actually two chief priests, oddly enough, at this point. Annas had been originally appointed, but was deposed by the Romans. His son-in-law Caiaphas was serving kind of as the formal chief priest, but many people regarded Annas as the true chief priest because under Moses it was a lifetime appointment. So you got these two guys kind of playing off of each other in that role. It may have been one of the two of them or somebody on their behalf who's showing up. You also have the scribes, the professional scholars, the Bible experts, and you also have the elders. That represents the Sanhedrin, as it were, the parliament of Israel, dating clear back to the time of Moses and the 70 elders in Numbers 11. This body had persisted down through the centuries and continued to operate to this day. These people were the authorities with respect to the temple. So they had a very significant and prestigious capacity. They were intermediaries, in a sense go-betweens, between Rome on the one hand and Roman power and the Jewish people on the other. They had to talk to both sides, try to maintain a certain peaceable relationship there. They were also over the Jewish religion of the day. They were advisors in politics. These were the brass. These were the people who really were not questioned in terms of how the temple was to operate. And as we were pointing out last week, these were folks who made a whole lot of money in the meantime by virtue of their cozy relationship both with Rome and with the temple. So these people come, it's an official confrontation. It's the culmination of a series of conflict moments that are peppered throughout Mark's gospel. It's the last of them, the most severe of them, and the one that really ties together a lot of what we've seen otherwise. So they come along and they say, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? It's a rhetorical question. They didn't expect an answer. They expected Jesus to wilt on the spot. They're showing up. They've got all the power, at least apparently, in their corner. The colloquial way we would represent their question in our parlance would be something like, who do you think you are? What right do you have to do this stuff? Who gives you the right to run around upsetting the apple cart around here? It's that kind of thing. They don't expect Jesus to answer. They expect that he's going to kind of panic. He hasn't been to Jerusalem, at least as Mark tells the story, in such a way that there's been this sort of public confrontation. It's kind of like when Martin Luther was at the Diet of Worms against the emperor, the pope, all of the brass of the world, the political and ecclesiastical authority against one lone monk. They just thought he was going to wilt. And as a matter of fact, it was, of course, in that context, he says, here I stand. Jesus, of course, vastly more than Luther, is in a similar kind of situation, being confronted by all of these powers. So this is really the moment in which we have Mark bringing together the authority theme of the whole book now at this moment of confrontation. Mark has been about the authority of Christ all the way through. The first half, the authority of his person, The second half, the authority of his office, all of this has been the underlying kind of common denominator, and now we find this authority brought into immediate and sharp confrontation with the authority of the temple. It's the authority of heaven versus the bureaucratic authority of this world, and here they are, and the question is put, whose authority is at work here? And in a greater sense, whose authority is going to prevail here, as this question is put by these people to Jesus? It's an interesting question they ask him, in a sense, who do you think you are, you know? Who did Jesus think he was, really? Who did he think he was? You look at the things he did, you look at the things he said, the claims he made, the unequivocal demands that he spoke. You look at the testimony of history and millions of people after that life he lived who have concurred in the conviction that he thought he was God. He believed he was God among us. Now, a lot of people in history have been delusional on that and thought, I've heard people say that. I saw a movie, Shirley MacLaine stood on the beach and said, I am God. I don't believe her. But somehow when Jesus says it, I believe it. What is it that he believed about himself and was so convincing that he's gotten this literally billions of people in the world in history now to believe it with him? I love the answer from C.S. Lewis. Many of you have read this text, one of his more famous paragraphs. Lewis says, this is in Mere Christianity, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. Lewis says, that's the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, you can kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He never intended to. Anyone who says the kind of things Jesus said is something other than simply a great moral teacher. And Lewis, I think, has his finger right on the pulse of what Mark and of what the entire Bible is intending and insisting that we face. This is a conflict moment. It's the seventh of what we've been calling conflict stories throughout Mark's gospel. Mark is very tightly organized, and we see now the culmination of these stories. The conflict stories, each of them, involve Jesus in a conflict with the entrenched authority that had worked very diligently to build walls so that you could have a clear distinction between insiders and outsiders. That was what they were about, distinguishing those who were inside from those who were outside. And in each case, in these conflicts, Jesus reaches across that wall. He breaks down the wall, reaches across the divide, and pulls somebody in who was regarded by these religious elite as unworthy of coming in. So the first of them, Jesus reaches across the wall to the sinful, the healing of the paralytic. The second of them, he reaches across the wall to a dishonorable person, a publican, Levi. In the third of them, he reaches across the wall to someone who doesn't take on the rigorous disciplines of religious life, the question of fasting. In the fourth of them, he reaches across the wall to people who are burdened and heavily laden by the imposition of Sabbath rules and related kinds of legalistic standards, and he pulls them in. In the fifth of them, he reaches across the wall to a man who's been broken in body and spirit, and is regarded as unworthy of approaching into the presence of God, the man with the withered hand. In the sixth of them, he reaches across the wall even more dramatically than any of the rest to the Gentiles, when he abrogates the rules of clean and unclean, Mark chapter 7. But this is the culminating conflict story. In a sense, he reaches across the wall from the temple to the world by announcing that the temple is now going to be a very different kind of thing than anybody ever imagined before. And now the true temple of God becomes, in a sense, the heart of the matter in this final conflict story. Interestingly, this conflict story is in 7 little pieces, and we're covering the first of these 2 today. So the first of them, the authority that undergirds this true temple of God. The second of them, how the true temple of God must displace the temple of concrete and mortar that is going to be left without one stone upon another. The third of them, the relationship between this true temple of God and civil authority in this world. Are we rebels? How do we live in this world where there is civil government as part of this true temple of God? The fourth of them, how does the true temple of God connect to eternity? The whole question of resurrection raised by the Sadducee. The fifth of them, the true temple of God and the heart of its ethical principle, the great command, love God, love your neighbor. The sixth of them, the ruler of the true temple of God, David's son, who is, of course, Jesus himself. And Jesus raises that question when he asks, how is it that David will say of his son that he is also his Lord? Psalm 110. And then finally, as they used to say in my Baptist church, the altar call. The conflict, or this conflict story in 7 parts, ends when Jesus says, there in that open setting, to all of those who are standing there listening to this conversation, now's your time to choose. Are you going to stay with a temple that's bound to go down? Are you going to stay on the ship Titanic, which is doomed? Or are you going to align yourself and become a part of this new and true temple of God, which is a living organism of which I myself am the cornerstone, rejected by these builders, but accepted by God? And are you going to become a part of that living, organic temple that is no longer going to be localized in a certain place, but will eventually dominate the whole world, which it's going to be? And so that's where we are right now. That's the story, and we're, as I say, in the first 2 of those little sections. So Jesus answers them and says, okay, guys, I will answer your question if you answer mine. It seems, I suppose, a little cheeky on Jesus' part to dodge the question, but actually this was considered very good style in rabbinic discourse. In fact, rabbis were considered very bright if they didn't simply answer a question, but posed a different question that forced the conversation to go to a deeper level. And so what Jesus does here is very rabbinic, and they would not have been put off by that in itself. They were probably surprised that he said anything, but that he actually responds in such a thoughtful and rabbinic way may have surprised them even more. They thought that they were going to put Jesus on the horns of a dilemma. As it turns out, he reverses the tables. And the way that Mark puts this, Jesus answered and said to them, I will also ask you one word. That's the Greek word, logos. I will ask you one word. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. The one word, John. The baptism of John, where did it come from? Heaven or from men? This is a literary synecdoche, as it's called, for the English folks in the room, the grammarians. This is where the little part stands for the whole. So when Jesus talks about the baptism of John, he means the entire ministry of John. He means not only his baptism, but his sermons, his counsel, his pronouncements, his claims. All of that is, in a sense, packaged in this reference to his baptism. So really the question Jesus puts to these folks at this point is, tell you what, you tell me your assessment of John and whether or not his ministry was with the imprimatur of heaven. Was he speaking God's truth? Was he acting with God's approval, or did it simply come from men? What's your view of it? Is it from heaven or from men? You're asking a question about my authority, so I ask you a question about John's authority. It's not mentioned directly, but clearly this reference to John is also dripping with the fact that John had publicly affirmed Jesus. Jesus was baptized by John. John testified to the events connected with his baptism. Jesus had been anointed, a dove coming down from heaven. In a sense, that became John's stamp of approval on Jesus. So, QED, if they're going to affirm John, then they're stuck with an affirmation of Jesus, you see. And so this comes a lot more immediately to mind, I suppose, as the question is put to them. Jesus stands for a moment in silence, and then the way you might demand it of a little child, he says, "Answer me." Which is it? Well, they took to reasoning among themselves. If we say from heaven, he's going to say, "Why didn't you believe him?" The word reason is dialogizisthai. It's the word from which we get the word dialogue. It's always used in Mark in a negative sense, a way to wiggle out from under a problem. And so that's what they're doing. They're faced with a very ticklish kind of question here. What are we going to say? And they're looking at probing one possibility. If we say, well, we think John was actually a true prophet of God, why didn't you believe him? And implied in that question, why don't you believe him, especially as it regards me, who's right here in the temple confronting you with this question? So they don't like that option. Let's look at the other side. How about we say it's from men? Well, then they fear the people, because everybody counted John to have been a prophet. From men, if we say from men, it's an incomplete sentence. It's as if it says, let's not go there, you know. If we say from men, the outcome there is just as bad. So they're stuck in this rather tricky political balance. I know many of you have read Machiavelli. I suppose since I taught political theory for a few years, I think I've probably read Machiavelli's The Prince at least 10 times, maybe 15 times over the years. I never cease to be amazed at the profundity of the man's insight. He's gotten a bad rap in history, to be honest with you. Not that I embrace his philosophy generally, but he does put his finger on some very, very helpful insights, one of which is that anybody in political power has to appear to be a statesman, but to put it in my language, has to always pay attention to focus groups. You know what I'm saying? You've got to look like you're leading, while what you're really doing is following. You've got to get the pulse of the people and then look as if you're going to lead them as a great courageous person in the very direction they wanted to go anyway. And so political power really does amount to that kind of delicate tightrope walking. Now, 2,000 years before Machiavelli said that, Aristotle already had figured it out. He taught that the test of a statesman is not the ability to keep his office by saying what is politically popular, but the courage to put his office at risk by saying what is politically unpopular but true. And that's really the test of the politician versus the statesman. Interestingly, our religious leaders here don't have the guts to do either one. No matter which path they walk, they're going to get in trouble. If they say the politically popular thing, you see. Yeah, John the Baptist, great guy. We thought he was wonderful. Boy, you know, preached the message of God. They realize that by doing that, they have just torpedoed everything that makes life so good for them. They have just sabotaged their cozy situation with Rome. They have just put a grenade under the lucrative business of running the temple. They have just undercut their own prestige among the people. Everything is going to be lost if they endorse John the Baptist. So I'm going to do that. But of course, if they discount John the Baptist, then they're going to run the same risk because they as Machiavelli said, need the people to respect them to keep their position. If in mass the popular opinion turned against them, they are in so much trouble that they're going to lose it all either way. See? So what are you going to do? And they come back with this remarkably insightful answer: beats me. That's a good question. You know, we've been wondering about that, but haven't quite figured it out. Here are the most sophisticated religious, philosophical, political minds in Israel asked a question about one of the most famous people in the recent history of Israel, a man who had just been martyred by Herod Antipas out north not that long ago. And these guys who claim to have such subtle insight into so many nuanced questions about life in Israel can't answer this one. Which, of course, we realize is not that they can't answer it, it's that they won't answer it. And their plea of ignorance is therefore, at best, dishonest, hypocritical. I don't know if you've ever met folks like this. I have occasionally had conversations with folks who just can't quite make up their mind about Jesus. They want to be open-minded. They still have to gather more evidence. They think it's kind of a healthy skepticism. They don't want to rush to an opinion prematurely, you know. You find this especially among certain scholars. They just keep wanting to learn but never come to a knowledge of the truth, as Paul says. And you kind of get the flavor of that, you know, in these guys as well. Well, Jesus, in the spirit of his own counsel, don't cast your pearls before swine, says, okay, fine, I'm not going to answer your question either. If you're not prepared to give a thoughtful, responsible answer, then why in the world should I? You know, we shouldn't, as Christians, run around calling people swine. But you know, I'm going to tell you something. Sometimes folks will ask me a question, and you had the same experience, and you can tell, though it may be a critical question, critical of the Christian faith in some aspect or other, it's nevertheless sincerely driven. It's sincerely motivated. Well, if God is love, then how come he destroyed all those people in the flood? I don't get that. Well, that's a question I'd like to talk about. That's good. Let's talk about that question. But sometimes it's just nitpicking, carping, cheap shots, no interest in an answer, just an interest in trying to score a few points in some interesting one-liners. You know, why bother? Why bother? It's never going to get anywhere anyway. Till God starts changing the heart and makes those questions something a little more sincerely motivated, what's the point? And so Jesus here with these guys, what's the point? But in spite of that, he does give them the answer, and in no uncertain terms, but he does it in his uniquely compelling way. He does it by the vehicle of a story, a parable, and it's the parable of the vineyard, and the meaning is not even a little bit obscure. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard, but they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another. That one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. Finally, he had left one son, the one he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, surely they'll respect my son. But the tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him. The inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read the scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this. It's marvelous in our eyes. Then they looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd. So they left him and went away. Familiar story, isn't it? It's one that's famous. The parable of the vineyard. It involves a vineyard. It involves a hedge. It involves a wine vat. It involves a tower, vine dressers, and an owner who's gone for an extended period of time. This is the only parable that Jesus tells, a true parable in Mark's Gospel, outside of chapter 4. This is a parable of the kingdom for sure, as were the parables in chapter 4. The difference is in chapter 4, it was too soon to unwrap the nature of the kingdom yet. And so Jesus said to his disciples privately, "To you it is given to know the secrets of the kingdom, and to those outside I speak in parables, so that hearing they won't hear, seeing they won't see." The time isn't right yet. But now you see we're at the moment where the kingdom is going to be established. The great cutting ceremony that will bring it into effect is going to take place in just a few days. The new covenant is going to be established at this point, and the kingdom is going to arise out of what will become the ashes there in that physical place. The new Jerusalem rising out of the old, the new temple out of the old, you see. And so now a parable is clear-cut, not ambiguous, not the least bit mysterious. This parable probably could be best conceived of as the judicial opinion of the judge. It's delivered in open court. The temple, in a sense, was the court. It's in the matter of the defendants, namely the religious leaders who had breached their fiduciary obligation with respect to the temple. It has a jury, namely all the people who are gathered there to witness this interaction between the judge now and those who are the defendants. And it appeals to a very familiar story. They all recognized it virtually when Jesus said the first three words. Because this story of the vineyard is one of the most famous parables, one of the most famous stories or metaphors found in the Old Testament. And I guarantee you everybody within earshot of Jesus had read this story, knew it, and most had probably memorized it. So they recognized it. It comes from Isaiah chapter 5. If you know the book of Isaiah, you know that this great prophecy, 66 chapters, the first 5 chapters are a kind of overture, in which all the major themes of Isaiah are touched on briefly. When you go to a musical, you'll hear the overture. All the major musical themes are touched on briefly. This is exactly what Isaiah does. One of the themes, of course, is God's certain judgment based on the idolatry and the breach of fidelity of these people toward their God. And it is called the parable or the metaphor of the vineyard. Listen to it both for the similarities and for the differences. This is in Isaiah chapter 5. This is God speaking, of course, through the mouth of the prophet. "Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug up and cleared out stones. He planted it with choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst, and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done to my vineyard that I hadn't done? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it'll be burned. I will break down its wall, and it'll be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug. It shall be briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry for help." So you can see the similarity. It's striking, really. And as I say, the people hearing Jesus immediately identified this as a kind of restatement in somewhat different terms of that. The vineyard manifestly is Israel. The tower would be the temple in the center of the life of Israel. The hedge, God's protective, providential care of Israel. The purpose, to yield a harvest that would produce wine, which was a standard metaphor for salvation to the nations. God leases it, as it were, or the owner leases it to the vine dressers. These are tenant farmers, common practice in the ancient world. They can run the place as if it were their own. They can live off the produce of the labors of the land, but they're expected to pay a dividend on an annual basis to the true owner of it. So it's an investment on one part and a means of labor on the other. Clearly what's going on here is these fiduciaries, these religious leaders, have been entrusted with the temple. They're supposed to be paying a dividend of salvation and worship and fidelity to God, but they have usurped that position and taken it as if it were their own and used it as their own revenue stream at the expense of the God who actually owns it. The one who owns it goes away, far country, allowing the tenants to become arrogant and complacent. Now vintage time rolls around, he sends a servant to receive that dividend. This is when blessings should be flowing from the vineyard to the world. The servant, of course, standing for those many, many prophets that God sent to his people down through the centuries. This was the first of many. The dividends were supposed to be collected and paid, but what do these guys do? They beat him, they send him away empty-handed, describing the abuse, of course, to which most of the prophets in Israel were treated. So rather than exporting blessings, the vineyard becomes a crime scene. Again, he sent them another servant. At him they threw stones, wounded him, sent him away shamefully. Some have tried to identify Jesus' description here with particular experiences of particular prophets. I think the better view is simply it's kind of a broad, generic description of what took place with most of the prophets who were treated to all kinds of different abuse. Jeremiah was imprisoned, as you know, lowered into a cistern for 30 days, arm deep in the mud, and so on. Other prophets were given similar kinds of abusive treatment. It's not difficult to see the documentation of this sort of thing in Israel's history. Again, he sent another. Him they killed, many others, beating some, killing some. The Old Testament, Jewish literature generally documented in some detail the abuses that were given to those prophets that God had sent. Hebrews 11, sometimes called the Hall of Fame of Faith, is a good place to kind of get the short version of that story. So finally, time's up. Now judgment is going to finally fall on these tenants. The corrupt leaders who are represented by those tenant farmers are going to face the music, and all of those who align themselves with them. But again, if you notice this, the parable that was told by Isaiah talks about the destruction of the vineyard. The vineyard's going to be destroyed. Notice that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says the vineyard is going to be taken from you and given to others. Because there is in the vineyard in this case those who are faithful. They've been looking for the kingdom. They've been looking for Messiah. They have genuine faith. They haven't bought off on this fake religion that is being peddled to them by these religious. No, they've been looking for the truth of God. And they're not going to be destroyed. They're going to be saved in this process, as a matter of fact. So while judgment is going to fall on those who breach their duties, the vineyard itself, as Jesus tells the story, is going to be salvaged. Well, this landowner still has one son, his beloved. He sends him saying, surely they'll respect my son. Jesus, again and again, affirms his unique status in history. This is what led C.S. Lewis to that remarkable statement he made. Notice that Jesus is not just one more prophet. As he tells the story, he's not just another in a long line of folks who have come appealing. This is a unique individual who is styled the Son. There is this expectation that at least the Son would be respected because he's the true heir. He is the true king. He is the Messiah. So this overly generous, prodigal father continues to show mercy and give the tenants an opportunity, one last one, to repent. But those vine dressers said among themselves, "Hey, this is the heir. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And again, the implication in the parable is these guys knew who Jesus was. They knew this was the Son. This wasn't some kind of surprise. They recognized the heir. One commentator said Jesus' claims had been unambiguous, his proofs of his integrity irrefutable, the conclusions of his identity irresistible, and so they really simply fall into delusional thinking. They think they can get rid of the true heir and usurp control of the temple and all of its great productive possibilities. It's been delusional thinking by everybody down through history who's tried to attach a price tag to God's grace. This is what Martin Luther was objecting to when he tacked 95 Theses on the Wittenberg church door. Pope Leo, bless his heart, was trying to sell mercy. See? He was trying to put a price tag on forgiveness. Buy this piece of paper and you can be forgiven. And Luther said, "I don't think so." And down through history, again and again, you find folks who've tried to sort of take that which God freely gives and make it a commodity and make themselves brokers of it. And it didn't work for Pope Leo X. It didn't work for these religious leaders. It doesn't work for cult leaders or any other religious types that try to pervert God's grace into something that can be bought and sold in a marketplace. So Jesus says what these guys do in their delusional thinking is they took him and killed him and cast him out, of course describing the very thing that would happen to Jesus within the next few days. It's descriptive of a great deal of what has happened in religious and political reactions to Christ down through history. You know history well enough to know that if you trace since the time of Christ, especially in the West, leaders, kings, prime ministers, rulers, politicians, dictators, etc., generally speaking, you can put them in one of two classes: those who recognize King Jesus and those who don't. Leaders who have at least openly, publicly acknowledged King Jesus tend to do better than those who don't. I realize there's exceptions to the rule, and like I say, I'm going to be cautious in saying this, but I think a general survey of history suggests that maybe Jesus really is ruling and does bump off upstart rulers, prime ministers, presidents, dictators who somehow thumb their nose at his authority. It's certainly what the Bible leads us to believe. Psalm 2, "Why do the nations rage? The people plot a vain thing. Why do the kings, the prime ministers, the presidents, the dictators, the tin horns, the people who put themselves into these political positions of power, why do they set themselves up and take counsel together against the Lord and against his Messiah, saying, 'Let's break their bonds to pieces and cast their cords. Let's throw off the strictures of the rules of this Messiah. Let's call evil good and good evil. Let's redefine the fundamental institutions of life that were given to us by God. Let's remake humanity in the form of what we prefer rather than in what God has ordained. Let's just do that.' And how much does the one who sits in heaven feel intimidated by this kind of behavior? He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he speaks to them in his wrath and distresses them in his deep displeasure. 'Look, I've set my king on the holy hill of Zion, the true Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Ask of me, I'll give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. You'll break them with a rod of iron. You'll dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. So therefore, wise up, kings, senators, parliamentarians, prime ministers, and all of you who are in positions of authority. Take a lesson, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss, meaning the reverential recognition of authority. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way when he's just a little bit upset. Because that's all it takes to bump you off and to dash your authority like an empty vessel. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. If the New Testament is correct, King Jesus is ruling today over the universe, and every person in political authority in this world is obligated to serve him. And that may seem a little bit outrageous in our pluralistic society, but I'm just saying you can't read the Bible very long or very far before you bump into that proposition, and it's pretty much an immovable core of the biblical message. And in some ways, it's what these guys were bumping into now when they were confronting Jesus in a temple on a Tuesday morning. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. Notice that? The vineyard taken from them, given to others. This whole conversation started with their rhetorical question, what gives you the right? Jesus now asks them a rhetorical question about what's actually going to happen. Matthew actually has these people answer the question. Matthew tends to emphasize the self-incrimination of the unbelieving Jewish nation, the culminating expression of which is Matthew 27:25, his blood be on us and on our children. A verse that's been extremely difficult and troublesome down through history, and again has been the basis for a certain degree of tragic anti-Semitism. But the fundamental idea is not an assessment against Jewish people again or any such thing, but it is the unbelieving people there who were in fact committing treason against their covenant Lord. Mark and Luke both have Jesus answer his own question. Luke adds, God forbid, when Jesus answers the question, showing how clearly they understood it. But the one thing that's clear from all of it, the crux of the sentence of judgment pronounced by Jesus, the kingdom that you should have been involved in as builders and architects, it's taken from you. You're guilty. You're found guilty. The sentence of execution is now being pronounced. Haven't you read the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Christ, the Messiah, is the cornerstone, the living cornerstone. It's the Lord's doing. The temple that is now going to be built is not a temple of concrete and mortar, of the stuff of this world. It is the temple of living, organic creations of God. We become part of it by regeneration, washed in baptism, brought in, made part of this temple in which Christ himself was the original cornerstone. It's from Psalm 18, which celebrates worship in the true messianic temple. It's announcing a living cornerstone of a temple that would be rejected by the builders. Paul and many others throughout the New Testament celebrate this point. Now therefore you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens in Israel, with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. I know I keep beating this drum, but it's something that I think we need to always appreciate, that this is the genius of the New Testament, that we are in fact that temple, and that where we gather together, that is, properly speaking, the place of God's habitation. It's the Lord's doing. This is why the book of Revelation speaks of this new temple, this new Jerusalem is coming from heaven, because it is something God has created. It's not something that's built out of the stuff of this world. Well, they didn't like it much. They sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them. They knew it. So they left him and went away. Interesting. in almost an outrageous kind of way, begin to plot doing the very thing the parable had predicted, you see. They have to do it in the shadows. They have to do it secretly in a corner at night because they don't want to arouse the multitude. They knew this was not an obscure thing, that he'd spoken it against them. The question of authority had become the basis for the pronouncement of judgment, and so they left in that spirit and went away. It was not an accident. Jesus was nobody's victim. All of these happened because God had in fact ordained it should happen. That's why Peter said to some of these same people on the day of Pentecost, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you took by lawless hands and crucified, putting him to death. What you intended for harm, however, God intended for good," as Joseph said to his brothers. Jim Edwards, on this question of the sovereignty of God in this whole business, says the following: "The parable's testimony to the sure purposes of God conveyed a profound sense of hope to Mark's beleaguered church in Rome, so ravaged by Nero's insane persecutions, as it can also be in our day when the church, at least in the West, is often caught in the compromise and confusion and decline. The existence of the vineyard is assured not only by the self-aggrandizement of the tenants, but by the self-sacrifice of the Son." I misread part of that, but you got the message there. All right, quickly, Sunday school lesson. We each have a duty to speak truth for fear of God rather than obscure truth for fear of men. The religious leaders didn't want to give an answer. They didn't like either answer, and in their cowardice, they said nothing. Paul, on the other hand, in Galatians said, "Do I seek to please men? If I still please men, I would not be the bondservant of Christ." We should all follow Paul's model. Sometimes it's popular to say something aligning yourself with Christ. Many more times it'll put you in the position of a kind of social pariah. But one way or another, the price tag should be irrelevant as we speak the truth, not to please men, but to please God, as these guys on that occasion should have done. We each have a duty to steward a vineyard, the purpose of which is to produce a harvest of blessing for everyone we meet. The story about a vineyard is a story about every one of us. You have a vineyard, I have a vineyard. Some of us have good-sized vineyards, some of us have very tiny ones, but we all have a vineyard. It's not yours. You are a steward, you're a tenant farmer, and your task is to take very good care of this that's under your stewardship so that you can honor God with the produce of it and be one of those who therefore receives his blessing rather than his judgment for malfeasance. And finally, we each have a duty to exercise authority, whether great or small, with absolute allegiance to the King, who rules from the true Mount Zion. The kings of the earth take their stand against the Lord and against his anointed. Every one of us in this room is a bit of a king or a queen over some little domain. Every one of us can do that, or every one of us can kiss the Son and recognize he is in fact the proper Lord and King of all that we are and all that we own and all that we hope to accomplish in all of our lives. And so for all of that, I hope this has been a helpful reminder.